Alrighty, so hello everyone. I hope you are all having an amazing Friday and are looking forward to the festivities of homecoming this coming week. I know I am. We have, it looks like a lot of people on the Zoom, so hello everybody on Zoom. I am going to kind of start us off a little bit differently than we might normally start, and that is because unfortunately Dr. Zelmer got sick this morning and is not able to be with us this week. We are working on rescheduling her, so she should be here pretty soon. When I say pretty soon, it's going to be in the coming weeks. So just keep an eye on our social media and our newsletter, and we will make sure to update you on when she will be here. But that said, we are still here for a presentation. And let me go ahead and get it up on Zoom. And then I will show you the craziness that we are going to go through today. So as some of you might know already, I did my undergraduate thesis on this exact topic. So we are going to hear my thesis today. Hopefully you guys will enjoy. Just a disclaimer, I have not looked at this save for this morning whenever I was building this PowerPoint since I was an undergrad, which was about 2019. So we're gonna go through this, but just bear with me if I stumble a little bit or if my knowledge is a little bit outdated. So that being said, let me click on our screen here, minimize that. Okay, so I'll just start kind of with the background. So I called this presentation The Haunting Truth Crime Mapping Around Cemeteries in New Orleans. And the reason that I chose that is because at the time I was pursuing a degree in legal studies with a minor in geographic information systems. And I had a really amazing opportunity to attend the National Collegiate Honors Conference in 2019, which just happened to be in New Orleans. And my research advisor just happened to be doing research on New Orleans and the crime that is going on around different touristy locations at that time. And so it just kind of all fell into place for this presentation to, or well, this project to really happen. And also I have a little bit of a personal interest in New Orleans. As we're going to talk about the cemeteries, they are just so vastly different from anything that you might see anywhere else in the United States. They are more similar to some that you might see in Europe or in South America. And that's just because of the nature of New Orleans. It is below sea level technically, and so obviously if you dig into the ground to put somebody there, you're gonna get faced with water pretty quickly. And nobody wants to put their loved one in a watery grave, unless they want to be buried at sea, in which case they're gonna be out at sea. And so I just kind of felt really interested and really kind of in a weird way in love with the architecture of the cemeteries in New Orleans. And because I was a legal studies major, I was really interested in looking at different ways to analyze these spaces. And so you'll kind of see some images that I took, as well as just some different maps and things that I created throughout this presentation. So I first want to start off with some stereotypes. So what are some things that you think of when you hear the word New Orleans? Or the city, New Orleans? Y'all can shout it out, or anybody on Zoom can put it in chat if you would like to. Let me open up this chat. Voodoo. Voodoo, definitely. Yeah.
Louisiana Creole.
Definitely. Yeah. Jazz music. Jazz music. Definitely. Anything else?
Mardi Gras.
Mardi Gras, yeah. Maybe spooky. Maybe unique a little bit. Maybe different, right? Because it is a place that is so different than like I said, what we normally would see. I see some chats. Let me check and see. Flooding, yeah, definitely. Cajun, definitely. So all of this does play into kind of the beauty of New Orleans. It plays into making this a very unique city, and it plays into kind of this image that people from around the world get in their heads whenever you hear about the city. For me, as a legal studies major, I hear high crime rates. I hear FBI location, because they do have a very, very busy FBI bureau in New Orleans. I hear a lot of tourism, so a lot of people are coming through. I also hear, just from my own personal interest, I hear beignets, Cafe Du Monde, all that good stuff. But definitely this mixes in a way that could heavily impact tourism and in a way that draws a lot more people into New Orleans. I think I have to click it. So whenever I was approaching this research, I really didn't do a lot of background research whenever it first came into my hands, whenever this research project first came to me. Really, I had been there a few times. I did a little bit of light research, watching people who had visited, kind of talk about their experiences there. And from what I could really tell, just based on my own experience, as well as that limited bit of research, I really thought that the French Quarter was a lot more protected. And I really thought that the cemeteries there are going to be less likely to have a lot of crime around them. And this was very simply because in the French Quarter, a lot of the cemeteries you have to pay to get into. And that's because they experienced a lot of vandalism, specifically like Marie Laveau, if you've heard of her, the Queen of Voodoo. It was common for people to go to her grave and dump all kinds of stuff on her grave, specifically like pink paint was a big one. And so because of all this vandalism, the city of New Orleans decided, well, we're gonna go ahead and try to preserve this part of our identity, this part of our legacy. And they went ahead and locked it up and made it a place that you now have to pay to get in. And you're not allowed to just go in on your own accord. You have to have a tour guide, and tour guides have to be registered. It's a whole process. And so because I saw that process happening more and more in the French Quarter, I really thought, well, this is protecting these cemeteries. And the ones further out in the city, as you start getting further and further north and west in Louisiana, are going to be less protected. And so that was what I really went into this project with. And again, I kind of, like I said, chose New Orleans because cemeteries are a big deal over there. It's kind of like one of their big drawing points. Their data is free and publicly available, which definitely played a huge role. A little bit of behind the scenes, like background on this. At this point, I had been through 3 different thesis topics, and I was not able to get through the other 2 because of data access or different laws that were in place, different issues that were going on. And so I ended up having to jump to a place that was publicly available. And like we've already talked about, the long history of crime rates and tourism. So these are, if you've not seen a New Orleans cemetery, this is kind of what you can expect. They're very crowded because the city is very built up. And they also have a few different options. And so the one in the middle is actually Marie Laveau. So you can kind of see how they have still had some issues with vandalism. They've still had some issues with people littering there. But it's not as pink as it used to be. They've definitely gone through and done some conservation to it. These ones up here, these are considered oven crypts. That's what they call them in New Orleans. And it's kind of weird to us because we have plenty of room for cemeteries. But in New Orleans, especially in the early days, not everybody could afford to be in a mausoleum. They were considered very fancy, very high end. You had to really have a legacy in New Orleans, or you had to have a lot of money to be able to afford a mausoleum. And so these oven crypts kind of solved the issue of the lower middle class and the poorer people in society. And basically what you did was you rented one of those cubbies for 1 year and 1 day. And at the end of that, you were presumed to have been decomposed enough that somebody else can take that slot. And so they would open up the crypt, they would shove kind of like a broom in there, and there would be a hole in the back. And your bones would then go to the very bottom and basically be a part of a communal grave. And then they would not necessarily clean it, and they would put somebody else in there. And so that was just how it had to happen in New Orleans, because in our area, we could just expand our cemeteries, but because they have the water issue, they didn't have as much space. And again, because the city was growing, they also didn't have that space. And so they are a pretty common part of the cemetery. Actually, in that far picture there, that is one of the cemeteries that is downtown. I did not quite catch which one. I think it's St. Louis #1, which is, I believe where Marie Laveau is actually buried. It may be 1 or 2, I can never remember, I always get it backwards. But you can see like there's lots of different shapes and lots of different mausoleums. And on the outskirts of it, kind of as like a fence, is where this oven crypts would go. So, we've kind of already talked about tourism, so I'm gonna skip over that. When I had the opportunity to go, what I focused on was the cemeteries that were further out. And what I noticed initially was they are very, very difficult to get to if you do not have a vehicle. We took the train car, or the streetcar in New Orleans to get to them, but we still had to walk at least a mile to get to them from where the streetcar left off. And so that kind of started changing my hypothesis a little bit, because if people have to go through all of that effort to actually get to the cemeteries, why go out there and vandalize? Why go out there and commit any crime? And so I was very surprised when I pulled up to Cypress Grove, which is one of the most northern cemeteries that is still technically within the parish of New Orleans. And I've got like the front gate over there, so you can kind of see it's like beautiful. It's supposed to be this like very marble white, pristine looking entry. And I will say I had like 5 minutes to get through the cemetery because of how long it took me to get there as well. They close the cemeteries at sundown, again, to prevent crime and vandalism and tourists going in there and actually like destroying slots or destroying graves. And so we got there and we thought, oh, we're gonna have like an hour. But then we didn't realize that the time was changing and it was, getting darker. And so we had 5 minutes. So we ran in, we snapped as many pictures as we could, and we ran back out. So these are very limited examples, but this right here is actually outside of the front gate. It is a guardrail that has been basically indented in towards the gate because somebody crashed into it. These middle two, the one at the bottom, that is a padlock. You can kind of see there were some people that were leaving what looks like cigarette butts on the steps of the mausoleum. And so they put a padlock to prevent people from getting in there and actually doing that. It's not stopping them from throwing it over the fence, but that's what the family decided they wanted to do. And then this top one, the gates are actually bent open. And so somebody has tried to get in there to just sit in the mausoleum and most likely do some kind of illegal drugs or drinking or something like that. Because a lot of times these cemeteries are also places where people go to hang out. Some of them are also different gates within the voodoo ritual. And so people do spend a lot of time there for a lot of different reasons. I actually had another picture and I wasn't able to find it, but at a different cemetery that I visited, there was actually a crypt that was completely broken open and the casket was still in there, but it was deteriorated. You couldn't really tell that it was a casket. It was more like wooded, but you could see bones kind of poking out as well. And that was something that somebody went in there and actually did. It wasn't caused by the collapsing of the coffin or anything like that. So then once I visited and I kind of got the sense of what was happening on the ground, I started looking into the laws that are in place. One thing that you may not know is that graves are yours into perpetuity, according to federal law. So once you are placed in the ground, that is your gravesite. Nobody is allowed to touch it. Nobody is allowed to move you. There is a whole process if your family does decide that they want you moved to a different location, or if the cemetery needs to be relocated for any reason. It might be, land is needed for different developments, or maybe there is some kind of historical, potentially archaeological site underneath the cemetery. That happens a lot. And so there's a whole process, and you have to petition the courts, and the court has to contact your next of kin, and depending on the age of the cemetery, it might be impossible or next to impossible to contact that next of kin. Maybe their contact has changed, or they might have passed, or who knows. And if they can't find that, then there's another petition that needs to be filed, and then the court has to meet and decide that there is a good enough reason for you to be exhumed and moved, or for the cemetery itself to be moved. Most of the time it is incredibly difficult, and it does not tend to happen very frequently. And so you can kind of rest assured that where you are put is yours. And that's kind of the goal. In America, we very much view both the funeral industry and death and dying as, we are keeping our loved ones safe. And so that is kind of the purpose of this law, is to make sure that no matter what happens in the future, your loved one is still resting peacefully. In Louisiana, they actually have taken it a step further. And again, this is from 2019, so it might have updated a little bit since then. But there are two different statutes that protect cemeteries in Louisiana, which is additional red tape that you would have to jump through in order to even get to federal court to petition the court to move the cemetery. The first is the revised statutes, and it's Title 8, which is, nicely called cemeteries. And they have a difference between perpetual care and historical care. Perpetual care is the idea that it's kind of following that federal law that you are protected into perpetuity. And so they tend to view more recent deaths and more recent burials as perpetual care versus historical care, which is looking at, like, for example, Marie Laveau. She has become kind of this icon of New Orleans. And so she falls under the historical category, and they look at a historical grave a little bit differently. They look at, what do we have to do to conserve this? What do we have to do to protect this? And it's less about the person and more about the actual memorial. And that also falls under the Historic Cemetery Preservation Act, that further defined what historical care was. And again, kind of went through and gave some specific examples and kind of set that criteria for what it was. And it basically was the age and the importantness, that's not a word, but you know what I mean. So, and then we also have the American funeral industry kind of playing into this as well. The American funeral industry is owned and operated primarily in the private sector. So it is not a public thing where anybody is basically given the right to a funeral through that specific funeral. Funeral homes can deny service, and they do this all the time. And it can be for a lot of different reasons. Most of my research was pointing to how the American funeral industry is very Christian focused. And so they can do, anything from like any denomination of Christianity. They can do those kinds of funerals very easily. However, specifically in Judaism, there is a lot more strict laws but to protect the loved one whenever they pass. Somebody has to sit with them from the time they pass until the time they are buried. There is also lots of different laws about what their grave can look like and how deep it has to be and how close they have to be to the dirt and all of that kind of stuff. I'm not a practicing Jew, so I don't know exactly all of the laws, but just from my research, that was what I was able to see. So I'm sure some of you may have some more information on that, but because many of the funeral homes are privately owned, if somebody comes to them and says, my Jewish grandma just passed away, and I would like to commission your service to help her be buried respectfully, they can say absolutely not, because we are not used to that. We do not want to deal with that. That is against what we do. And so that kind of also plays into the federal laws of, making sure that your loved one is taken care of from the time they pass into perpetuity. We also have the issue of, because people are being denied service, they have to go to a different funeral home or a different cemetery to find where they can bury their loved one. And because of this, a lot of new cemeteries are being created because of space issues. We are, as a society, we're growing and new cities are developing, cities are being expanded, and the use of land is very much in favor of the living. And so sometimes we have this conflict of, we are supposed to protect this person, we have this obligation to them under the federal law, and, we need to find some space to make sure that everybody has that same right. And so this is causing a lot of the same issues of trying to make sure that we have space for everybody and trying to make sure that everybody is protected. So now I'm gonna jump into crime mapping a little bit. And so I took all of this, the laws, the issues, the tourism, like why New Orleans, all of that, and thought about it kind of over here in its own thing. And then separately, I was thinking about crime mapping, and crime mapping uses GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems. And I'll explain a little bit more of what that is on a future slide. But basically, geographers can take a ton of data, and it can be things like, here's where specific buildings are, here's where different land features are, or different, we call them hotspots, places that we want to map into GIS. And you can take all of that and kind of layer it together and then exclude certain things to be able to visualize your data. And just so you can see kind of an example, this is our crime map for Pensacola. And it has actually expanded since this morning. So you can kind of go in and see, these are all of the places. Each of these dots represent a specific area where a disturbance is happening. And these disturbances are being mapped or reported by our 911 operators. As they are reporting the crime to the police, to whoever needs to be involved, these are becoming data points. And so you can start seeing where things are happening in real time. So if you're interested in this, I can definitely share that with you. So that's just an example of what it is I was looking at. And I ended up taking that data and putting it into GIS, which, like I said, is kind of this layer cake. So you start with, what map are you starting with? So in this case, I was starting with a map of New Orleans, or technically Louisiana, and then you kind of zoom in on New Orleans. So it might be a city, it might be a country, whatever it is. And then what are your data points that you want to put in? So in my case, I wanted to start with where are the 45 cemeteries in New Orleans. So that way that data was. Then I can start putting in the calls for service, which is basically what they call the 911 calls in New Orleans in their open data portal. And you get like thousands of data points that you have to geocode, which basically means putting in that table that was at the bottom of our crime map into GIS, and it has the geographic points, and it pinpoints it on the map for you. I don't know exactly how it works, it's kind of magic, and it takes a long time. So if you ever get into crime mapping, just be prepared that it takes a long time if you have that size of data. And then you can start putting in different layers. Like for me, once we get to the methodology we're going to talk through, I decided that I wanted to put a half-mile buffer on each of the cemeteries and look specifically at the data points that were within that buffer. So, and I'll get into that a little bit more, but you can kind of see now how the layers are playing into each other and how you're taking all of this data and kind of cutting the pieces that you want. And that's essentially what GIS does, and it allows you to analyze a lot of different things. There's also an issue with GIS, and we refer to it as the projection. So what projection are you going to use? Basically, the way we're taught this is the idea of taking a beach ball and cutting it down one of the stripes and trying to lay it flat. You can't do that very easily unless you add more cuts to it or you stretch it different ways, and it distorts the shape of the beach ball as you're doing that. So if you get it flat and then you try to put it back together, it's not gonna go back together very easily. And so that is another thing that you have to think about whenever you are crime mapping, is you want to see what is more important. Is it important to preserve the shape of the city, for example, because then you have to use one type of projection? Or is it better to save the shape of the country? That's a different projection. The shape of the continent is another one. And it all just depends on how much stretch you're trying to give it. So for me, I took all of the calls for service from 2011 to 2018. So it was a pretty big data set, and I did it year by year, so that ArcGIS would not crash on me multiple times, even though it still did. And so I started this research in 2019, so I didn't have a complete data set for that year, which is why we stopped in 2018. I took and located all 45 cemeteries, and I decided that I wanted to preserve the shape of the city so that the calls in the cemeteries would be as close together as possible within the actual map. Like I said, I created those half-mile buffers, and the reason I did that was because I wanted to be as close to the cemetery as possible. One thing I forgot to mention is most of the cemeteries in New Orleans are either in people's backyards or they're along busy highways. And so obviously, if you have those things going on, there might be more calls of, we have a medical emergency within a house in the neighborhood, or there might be some kind of auto issue going on the road. And so I wanted to get as close as I could to the actual boundaries of the cemetery without completely limiting it to just the cemetery. And that was because most of the time the calls for service happen outside of the cemetery gates. And so very, very little of the data is actually within the cemetery. So these are kind of the steps that I took on the furthest side. Those are all of the calls for service for 2018. So each one of those dots is a specific area that somebody contacted 911 from in New Orleans over the course of 2018. Those circles I zoomed in kind of closer to the French Quarter, just because otherwise the map was going to be ginormous. And that was more where my hypothesis was anyway. I wanted to really focus in on that. And so each of those circles represent a cemetery, and the bigger circle is the buffer that I created. And so you can see how the dots were limited to just those areas. And then I looked at it through a heat map. And the heat map allowed me to really see the orange is there's a lot of calls, but they're kind of all the same type of call, whereas the red is the more different types of calls. And so you can see I was kind of backwards in my hypothesis. I forgot I had a laser pointer until now. So up here is kind of the ones that are further out from the French Quarter. This area, specifically this one and these two, are in what is technically considered the French Quarter. And so as you see further out, there's less calls, which was not what I expected to find. I really expected, because these were further out under less protection, we would, see the opposite. And so this is just some of the findings. I didn't pull all of them because otherwise we'd be here all day trying to analyze all of the years. But so I pulled 2011 and 2012 and then 2017 and 2018. So you can kind of see how it grows. In 2011, the most common call for service was a traffic accident, which I kind of expected to find because of how the closeness to different interstates or very busy roads. But then we get down into disturbance, which is just kind of a general, somebody's acting a little strange. And then suspicious, kind of the same thing, but it's less, they're causing a disturbance and more they're acting suspiciously. There were a few burglar alarms, and then we get into auto accidents and lost and stolen. This one is medical ambulance. Fugitive is somebody that's obviously supposed to be in jail but has ran away. There's a little bit of hit and run, and then municipal is things like broken water pipes or things that the city needs to repair. So in 2011, it was definitely a heavy year for traffic incidents. In 2012, it actually, we got some new data points, some new calls that were becoming really popular. I guess, not popular, but they were happening a lot more. And The one that caught me kind of off guard was this complaint other category, which is the top one for 2012. Basically, it is some kind of complaint going on that does not involve somebody causing a disturbance or acting suspiciously. It's just something else going on. It's kind of this miscellaneous category, which I thought was kind of interesting. Then we have traffic accidents and kind of the same things that we saw in 2011. And then jumping over to 2017, we see that complaint other has grown. So I guess people are just doing some weird things around cemeteries. But we still see, you know, the traffic incident, the disturbance, burglar alarms, like that kind of stuff has stayed the same. They were definitely like the top 3 or 5 that I saw throughout my research. And then in 2018, it was kind of the same as 2017, just the numbers kept growing. And so what I was really interested to see is the fact that we started off with traffic being kind of the issue, and then we started leading into more of the people being the issue. So like I said, I learned that there was a lot more crime in French Quarter than I anticipated, which is really interesting because when you go to New Orleans, it's probably like the first place you want to go visit. That is like the place that, you know, has Cafe du Monde, has a lot of shopping, has all kinds of places that people typically would want to go. And so it led me to really think about how safe is the French Quarter. And seeing that most of it was, you know, traffic and just people being people is what it seems like. It led me to really think about that it is kind of still safe as long as you stay out of the road. Because apparently drivers are going to be drivers and bad drivers are going to be bad drivers anywhere. There were also a surprising number of hit and runs and municipal results, which hit and runs are, you know, obviously hit and runs, which still involves traffic, which still leads you to stay out of the road. But the municipal is, like I said, those things that the city has to repair. And so it really was leading me to think that a lot more of the data was just the city needing to take better care of the areas that they wanted people to visit. And I also really thought about, is it the half-mile buffer? Is that too big of a buffer? Is that getting it too close to the roads versus more in the cemetery area that I wanted to focus on? So really my results were inconclusive, which is part of why I buried this as deep as I could until today. But it was still good research because it really allowed us to see, you know, we, for the most part, are doing a good job of protecting our cemeteries and protecting our tourist areas. We just need to make sure that the roads are a little bit safer and that the city is actually, you know, paying attention to these things that need to be fixed. So in conclusion, still has a lot of crime. New Orleans still has a ton of crime. I don't think that those numbers have gone down at all. I also need to look at it to confirm that, but just in my own perception of things, I don't think that it has gone down a lot. Not all of the crime is near cemeteries. So if we go back to the maps, you can kind of see, like, if I were to overlay this map and this map, more of the data points would be in between these circles. So not a lot of crime is really going on near the cemeteries, just like a normal city. A lot of the crimes are going on in the neighborhoods, at different places of business or places of worship, different things like that. So it still does protect the tourism of actually being at the cemeteries. And really, I think that a lot of the reason for it is just how hard it is to get into a lot of them. I think, you know, the paywall is definitely an issue. The fact that you take the streetcar and then it doesn't even get you close to where you're trying to be. Another cemetery that we tried to look at was quite literally someone's backyard. Like they had maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 feet of what I would call backyard space, and then it was a chain link fence, and there was the cemetery. And I remember being struck by this huge tree that was in the middle of the cemetery. We couldn't get into it, it had already been locked up for the night. But once I got back to my hotel, I actually found out that that was the final gate of the voodoo ritual. And so that one in particular was very it was a very interesting location. It was a very hard to get to. So I was surprised that that would be that seventh gate and it would cause people to go there for that reason. And I'm surprised that people were actually living so close to it as well. And so definitely those locations had a lot to do with it. It had a lot to do with the auto incidents that I was finding, a lot of the and a lot of the municipality things that I was finding as well. So that's really it. Thank you guys for sitting through that. I hope that y'all enjoyed it, and I have some time if you have any questions. So thank you. So yeah.
So when you were looking at it and if you were looking at any of, the crimes themselves, were you considering who was most likely perpetrating them, or in this case, probably drunk tourists themselves, if you wildly focused on the French Quarter?
Yeah, so the data that I had really didn't give me any kind of identifying information like that. It was definitely something that crossed my mind whenever I was looking at it. I really wanted to go further into this research and really look at like, who was causing more of the crimes for sure. Just from my observations being there, I think it was really 50-50. Sometimes it was the people that lived in different areas, sometimes it was the tourists themselves. And so that would be my perception, but I would love to see if that research holds, that hypothesis holds. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of ties into that question,
Yeah.
but I know you had said that the French Quarter cemeteries seem to have more crime around them. Do you know why that may be the case? Like, is it just that there's more people there?
I think so. Yeah, I think around the French Quarter it's very popular, and so there's a lot of hotels, a lot of Airbnbs. It's a lot of, like they try to keep it all within walking distance. And so I do feel like, just because bigger population, bigger crime rate, and like I said, I would love to know who it is actually that's causing that, because at least in a lot of people's perception, it's the locals that are seeming to cause a lot of issues whenever you're a tourist going there, because you're like, I'm gonna be safe, I'm gonna be the person that doesn't do anything wrong. And then you might get drunk on Bourbon Street and who knows what happens, but definitely, yeah, I think the bigger crowd, the more likely it is to happen. So, yeah.
When you were tracking all these were calls specifically, right? Not actual confirmed crimes. So a lot of them might have been, for example, someone calls about a crime, there's absolutely no crime, especially for the complaints.
Definitely. Yeah, and that was something that I went into as well in my thesis that I did not pull for this presentation. Because I definitely went down that same train of thought where they unfortunately the data when you get it is really just what it was and geographical location. There's not a whole lot of other data that goes along with it. And that is to protect the people that are committing the crime and the people that are responding. And so there's not really a ton of this was confirmed, or this was just a call, we're marking it because it was a call, we have to report how many calls we got. And so that is definitely another point that I was very curious about as well, is like, were people just calling just to call, especially about the suspicious people, or people just acting weird. So yeah, it definitely was something that I wish I had gone into a little bit more as well. Great question. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
Along with that,
Yeah.
Since these were all based on calls, is it possible that there were some more crimes committed in cemeteries and just nobody called about them?
Potentially. I don't know a ton about like the um the different rituals involved in like voodoo and that kind of stuff, but I feel like, if that's going on, that could lead to people outside kind of calling for like suspicious activity, but the people inside the cemetery actually being like, yeah, this is kind of normal. Like, I don't see why you're calling about this. Like, maybe we accidentally set a fire, but we put it out. We're not gonna call about that, And so I do feel like there's kind of that going on, but then I feel like, just because of the perception of the high crime rate as well, there might be, potentially gang activity. That's something that wasn't accounted for as well, that I was really interested in trying to find out, like, if this was the same groups of people trying to commit the same types of crimes. And so you know, that might be something else going on. They might be kind of protecting each other. There might be like this agreement going on that we just don't know about. So there is definitely a lot of unanswered questions with this research as well. So great thoughts. Yeah, either one.
You can go.
Go ahead and break up my thought. Break my question, I just didn't say.
I don't know if this was like within the scope of your research or not, but on your maps, were you able to see if any of those crimes were actually, or the calls were coming from inside the cemetery itself, or if they were all from within that buffer zone?
Yeah, if I had zoomed in further, I could have seen. But the issue with zooming in further is you start getting this kind of data overload because of the size of the data. And so you're not as easily able to see those dots. Not unless you completely like start from the beginning and pick one and then stick with that. And so unfortunately on the timeline that I had, I wasn't able to do that, but definitely something that I had looked into for future research, so.
Do you know what time the law started taking effect that gives perpetual ownership of graves? Because obviously that wasn't the case when they had the oven graves.
Yeah, well, it kind of was because you were still kind of guaranteed a space. And so because you had a space, you were still technically being taken care of into perpetuity. It wasn't like they were, you know, taking you out and throwing you into the river or something like that. There was this kind of catch-all at the bottom. And that's where the bones would collect. And so it might not be a dedicated spot like what we're used to, but it is definitely still a place that you can go and memorialize somebody. And so going back to this time of that law, I don't remember an exact year, but I want to say it was like mid to late 1800s was kind of when that started. I believe the Historic Preservation Act came earlier in the 1900s, but again, I could be very wrong on that. Those are just the dates that are coming to mind whenever I'm kind of, you know.
Maybe coinciding with the Civil War.
Potentially. Yeah, because a lot of the American funeral industry changed with the Civil War. That's where a lot of the embalming came from, because people were dying on battlefields like, you know, hours away from their home. And so obviously people wanted to still say goodbye to their soldiers that had died in battle. And so if they had money, they were able to get them embalmed and then taken back. If not, a lot of the times what happened was you were just buried on the battlefield. And that's why a lot of battlefields are still preserved today because it's technically a cemetery. So I think definitely it could coincide with that.
I think you have some questions on.
Yeah, I saw a bunch popping up. Let's see. Hog magic, I love that. Definitely. Do you think that people in the area get more offended with the classifications of different burial sites as opposed to just having one? Honestly, I don't think so. I think people knew kind of what options they had back whenever oven crypts were being more widely used. They're not as widely used today. They're going more the mausoleum route or going more out of the city to find actual like green area where they can establish a more traditional cemetery. So I don't think necessarily they were offended in terms of like the different levels of where you could be buried. I think they just knew that it was a very realistic thing for them. Do you think that most crime in cemeteries come from targeted or personal attacks rather than the area being convenient? Potentially. I don't know exactly how many people are like going to a cemetery to specifically commit a crime against another person. Honestly, I think I'm like processing your question, Kaylee. I promise I'm like getting there, but I think really it's kind of a mix. Like some of the cemeteries are more convenient to get to than others. And so I don't know necessarily that the ones that are more convenient are going to be like places where like, you know, we might see in a movie where somebody is like, you know, oh, I'm gonna meet you at whatever place and we're gonna have a duel or whatever, you know. I don't think that that's really happening as much, especially for the time period that I was looking at. Because this was pre-COVID too, and so people were kind of traveling a lot more and going to a lot more places, and so it might just be a good mix of, some of them are convenient by road, so a lot of the auto incidents are happening there. And the other ones just might be because they're in French Quarter and crime happens there. See, if the data from calls of a crime could be, or wait, if the data is from calls of a crime, could there be multiple calls reporting the same crime? Definitely. I wasn't able to get to that level of the data because of the size of the data that I was looking at. But definitely, I do think that it could be skewed. Because, it's, there's this, not principle, but like this idea that, it's like the bystander principle, I think is what it's called. Basically, if you are a bystander to a crime, people have one of two reactions. It's either we all need to call to make sure the 911 gets here on time, or somebody else is gonna call, so I don't have to. And so definitely that could be happening, in that case. Do you think that there was an increase in crime during certain years due to the political climate? That's another really good question. From that time period, in terms of politically, I think it was the end of Obama's term and the beginning of Trump's first term, I think. And so definitely we did see that shift in the political climate. I don't know that it's really significant in this case, because I think more of that crime was focused in more politically heavy cities, maybe like capital cities or like DC, for example. I don't know that people were specifically going to New Orleans to riot at that point in time or to cause any sort of a political issue. But I could be wrong. That's definitely something that I could look into a little bit more. So, any other?
Yeah, this is kind of a little more on the specifics about that Louisiana Title VIII with cemeteries. The historical versus perpetual care has Louisiana laid out kind of a time frame when a gravesite goes from that perpetual care over to historical care? Or is it more just like old graves that had already existed when the law was put in place are under historical care, and any graves going forward will remain perpetual?
Yeah, so I think in terms of specifics on that one, it was very much like the level of the historic nature of the cemetery. So the more crowded it was, the more unique it was. I feel like those were a lot more considered historical. They were looking more at, protecting the architecture of the city in that case. I don't know how it's changed over time. That's definitely something I would want to look into. But I think from what I can remember, the criteria was basically like cemeteries that are popular and have already existed at this point, and but not beyond, but previous, that's the word. Those were considered historical. But they still do kind of in a way fall under perpetual care because of that federal statute. And so in a way they're kind of the same, one and the same, but it's a lot more protecting the actual architecture than protecting individual graves. Yeah. Oh, anything else? Any other questions from anybody on Zoom or anybody in the room or anything? No? Alrighty, well, I really appreciate y'all's time today and I appreciate you sitting through this. I know some of the data is a little bit lost on me because of the time that it's been since I've actually looked at this, but I love all of your questions and I would love to definitely delve into this a little bit further. It's really inspiring me to kind of go back into this route a little bit. So thank you all for your time. Next week, we hopefully are going to be hearing from Todd Mulcher, who is our homicide detective who is going to be coming in. He has a conflict that potentially is still happening during our colloquium time. So it's potentially either going to be a pre-recorded session or we're going to get Dr. Zellmer in. So again, pay attention to the social media as well as the newsletters and all of that good stuff. We'll communicate it to you there. So have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.